as I said, so today I will explain what is mixing. So it's a notion which comes from dynamical system, which is stronger than ergodicity. And it turns out that it has a very concrete and interesting traduction or incarnation in the case of a unitary representation. And there is a famous theorem, which is the theorem of Howe and Moore, which was proved in the beginning of the 70s. And it says that for Lie groups, which are simple, then if you have a representation with no fixed point, then it is mixing. So this is a very general phenomena, and my goal today is to illustrate this in the easiest but still very interesting case, which I guess is the case of SL2R. Yeah. So let me go on. So I follow some lecture notes by Jess Peterson, and there is a very nice paper you can look at by Klaus Schmidt, where he explained very carefully all those notions, and he explained the translation from dynamical system to representation theory, one direction and the other, with all the technical hypotheses. This is a very carefully written paper. So what is the definition of an ergodic unitary representation? In fact, this is something which seems almost trivial. So you have a group, and you have a homomorphism from this group to a unitary group of Hilbert, of transformation of a Hilbert space H. So H is a complex Hilbert space, and UH is the group of all unitary transformation of this Hilbert space. And okay, so we have a homomorphism from G to this group, and we look at the fixed points, namely all vectors in the vector space, such that they are not affected when you apply one of these transformations. Of course, 0 is always fixed because pi of G is linear, but we say that it is ergodic if 0 is the only fixed point. Okay, so in other words, we call the representation, a unitary representation, ergodic if it has no fixed vector. So I will explain why this makes sense. And in order to explain why it makes sense, we should consider what is called the Koopman representation. So what is the Koopman representation? So suppose you have a group G, and this group, you assume it acts by measurable transformation on a probability space. Okay, so you have your space with your measure, your sigma algebra, and you have this group, and it transforms the space. And you may ask that the measure is preserved, but you also may ask something weaker, which is also interesting. So we assume only that the action preserves the measure class. What does it mean? So it means that if you have a subset of measure 0, then when you transform this subset by applying some elements of the group, so G acts on X, so G of B is a new measurable set, and you assume that it stays of 0 measure, okay? So in this case, it's a theorem which is called the Radon-Nikodym theorem. It says that in this case, you have a function such that the formula which I wrote here is true. Namely, in this case, when you change the variable, you see, instead of integrated the function on the space as it is, now you want to integrate the function, but here is the action. So of course, what you expect is that it will change because the action change the volume. So if you correct the change of volume, so may change the volume, right? If you have a transformation which is nice, but it could be expanding or contracting, then you have to correct. So this is correction term, so that the volume is locally preserved, infinitesimally is preserved, so that the volume is preserved. So that's a theorem that there is such a function, which I call it C here, like a cocycle. And this is the Radon-Nikodym derivative of the transformation G minus 1. Okay. It's like the inverse of the Jacobian in the case we are maybe most used. Think to the Jacobian in the change of variable formula. This is a special case.
So are you saying that the pullback measure is absolutely continuous?
Yes, exactly. This is exactly the hypothesis which is needed here. Perfectly. So
then we use G inverse, right? I mean, we use G inverse, right?
Yeah, but it's the same, right? Because I say it's for all G, and G is a group. So in fact, what I say is that the class of the measure is preserved. So it means that this G star mu is mu. And if you want to write it down in detail, then you are perfectly right. What it means is the following. If the measure is transformed, but here I only ask that the class of the measure is transformed. So this is when the measure itself is preserved. It means that in this case, the Radon-Nikodym measure, the Radon-Nikodym function is 1. This is the same as saying that C of Gx is 1. And otherwise, we say that both measures are absolutely continuous with respect to the other, namely that this measure is absolutely continuous with respect to this one. Okay, and you know there is a chain rule when you do when you perform a change of variable with the Jacobian, with the derivative. And in this case, the chain rule, it appears as a cocycle rule, which is the following one. Okay. So now, using those facts, you can consider what is the Koopman representation. So each time you have an action which preserves the measure class, then you can build a unitary representation. And this unitary representation is called the Koopman representation associated to the action. So what is the definition of this unitary representation? Okay, so here is the formula. So you take a function which is L2, and when you apply this transformation to the function, it's the case irregular representation here. So it means that you pre-compose by the inverse of the action, like the case irregular representation. So it defines a homomorphism, of course, but the point is that it may lead to a transformation which is not unitary. So in order to get something which is unitary, you take into account the correction of the volume. And this is because you have this term. So take into account the change of volume, the possible change of volume, when you act with G minus 1. So it corrects, and the effect of putting this correcting term is that it makes the representation unitary. And you see there is a square root, because when you compute the scalar product of the Hilbert space, then you have to put a square. So that's exactly what you need to get something which is unitary. And this is one technical exercise I propose, namely, check that indeed, if you apply this formula, you get a unitary transformation. So this step is easy. You just use this formula. You use this formula here, and you get easily that it's a unitary transformation. And if you use the co-cycle property, then you check that pi is a homomorphism. Okay, so I let you check those technical things. It's very nice to do it, because then you feel comfortable with the notion. Okay, but the main idea to retain is that, okay, each time you have a transformation, we can associate in a very natural way a unitary transformation. And this is called the Koopman representation. Now, assume that we are in the case where the action is measure preserving. So it means that, for example, you act with transformation which are isometric. Anyway, it should be measure preserving. So in this case, we have a probability space, and we can consider the function which takes the value 1 everywhere. So of course, this is a vector in L2. This is the constant equal to 1. And if you act by the quasi-regular representation, so it means that you perform a change of variable before you apply the function, but the function 1 takes everywhere the same value, so you do not have any effect when you perform this change of variable. So it means that when you apply it, and if the co-cycle is 1, then you does not change anything. So in this case, this function is a fixed point, right? So it means that we have a line which is a fixed line inside our Hilbert space. And this representation preserves and fix this line because the representation is unitary. So it means that the orthogonal to this line is also fixed. So the representation also preserves the orthogonal to this line. But what is the orthogonal to this line? So obviously, what you find is that all functions such that when you take the integral, you integrate them, you find 0. This is exactly the orthogonal complement of this. So you get a decomposition. I hear some noise from maybe some people have their microphone on, and then it's better if they don't use it, then they cut it so that we don't have some background noise. Yes, now it's good now. Thank you very much. Okay. Now, a very nice link appears now. As I said, why do we say that representation is ergodic if it has no fixed vector? This is because with this definition, you can prove that the action is ergodic if and only if the Koopman representation is ergodic. So I denote the restriction here. What is pi 0? Pi 0. Pi 0 is the restriction of pi mu to the orthogonal complement. Yes, okay. So in a way, what you do is you break your space in two components. There is one component which is obvious, which is made of constant function, and the other component which is made of functions such that the integral is 0. And of course, you want to forget the trivial components where you have only constant function and concentrate on what's going on the orthogonal complement. And that's what the Koopman representation restrict to this subspace is doing. So this is what we call pi 0, and sometimes this is called the Koopman representation. In fact, very often the Koopman representation is the restriction of what I call the Koopman representation. Okay, so just terminology. Okay, so in order to prove this, you just have to realize that all those components, they are preserved by the representation, and then it's obvious that you get ergodicity, namely the only function which are invariant under the action are the function which are constant, right? Yeah. And then because you forget the constant function, then you can show the equivalence. Now there is a stronger version of ergodicity, much stronger, which is called mixing. So what does it mean for a unitary representation? Maybe those people who have already studied representation theory, they know what is a coefficient of representation. So I will recall that. And the idea is that mixing is the same as saying that all coefficients, they vanish at infinity. So what does it mean? So the first thing we need to do is to make sense of what it means at infinity in a group. So for this goal, we will consider a topology on G. So we assume we have a locally compact group, and for example, a Lie group, and we assume it's sigma compact. So it means that I can describe G as a union, increasing union, a countable increasing union of compact subset. Okay, so sigma compact for a topological group, you know what it is. Okay, so suppose we have such a group, and suppose we have a homomorphism into a unitary group of a Hilbert space H. So we say that the representation P is mixing. So I say strongly mixing because there are other versions of mixing. There are weak mixing and other notion. Here it's strong mixing, so I will just say mixing. If you take any two vectors in your Hilbert space and you take any sequence in G which goes to infinity. So what does it mean to go to infinity? It means that eventually the sequence you consider, it will leave any compact subset of G. Okay, so for example, imagine you have a Lie group we could consider the simplest non-compact Lie group, so take R, and a sequence goes to infinity. You know what it is. This is something which should leave any compact. So each time you fix the compact, after some time it should never return to this compact. So in this case, we say that the sequence Gn, we write that the sequence goes to infinity. So it eventually leaves any compact. So of course, in order to say that, to make sense, I have to assume that G is a topological group, and I have to assume that I have at disposal some subspace which are compact, and that you can exhaust the group with compact subset. That's why I assume those topological assumptions on G. Okay, so I can make sense of going to infinity, and the statement is that it is mixing if the scalar product of those two vectors you choose in H, no matter what those V and W are, it will always goes to 0. So they will become orthogonal. At the limit, they will become orthogonal. They will have nothing to do with each other. That's what is called mixing. So at infinity, there is some sort of independence which is created. Okay, and you recover the notion of coefficient. This is the coefficient. From representation theory, usually you can, for example, you can write this coefficient of P. See, just a remark: if you never study what is a coefficient of a representation, you just take this definition. Okay, so here is a nice exercise. Prove that a mixing representation is ergodic. So this is super easy. In fact, it's obvious. You just look at the definition. I don't say more. And something much more interesting and not so easy, prove that the action of Z on the circle generated by a rotation of infinite order. So you remember with Weil law, we've seen this sort of example. So you have this dense orbit, okay? And you have to show that this action by Z, so Z is generated by rotation of infinite order. Okay, so of course it preserves the measure of d theta. D theta is preserved. So the Koopman representation, we can look at it. And we look at this Koopman representation. And the point is that this representation is ergodic, but it is not mixing. So this is a very well-known example. If you can't solve it, you can find the solution in any textbook or on the internet. So, but this is very important to have an example in mind where you see that something which is ergodic may not be mixing. So it shows that mixing is stronger than ergodic. So mixing is stronger than ergodic. And I will explain some intuition which comes with mixing in a few minutes, so that we understand really what's going on from the dynamical point of view. But let me go on with Overmoore's theorem before I do that. Okay, now we will need a technical condition on the representation we consider. In fact, usually what is called a unitary representation is not only a homomorphism from a group G to the unitary group over Hilbert space. So it's in fact assume always that the representation is called strongly continuous. So what does it mean? So first, we need to put a topology on the group. So we have a group, a topological group, and we have a homomorphism. And we say that this representation is strongly continuous if the following holds true: each time you fix the vector v in the Hilbert space, and you consider the map, which is simply to push this vector with the representation. So you see what you do is you look at the orbit of this vector v that you have fixed, and you analyze this map. Okay, so you have a map from G to H, because of course V is fixed. And now you push this vector with the action of G through the representation. And you ask that this map is continuous. So it makes perfectly sense, because G is a topological group. So you have a topology, and H is a Hilbert space. So of course there is a topology which comes from the norm. And the norm comes from the Hilbert, from the Hermitian product, or Hilbert product. Okay, so this is what is called strongly continuous. And here is the theorem. This is the main result I want to present today. So Hovmor's theorem on the vanishing of coefficient. Alors, in the special case of SL2R, I will say something about the generality of this result. This is very important to realize that this is a general phenomena, which is remarkable. But for the sake of simplicity, I would like to explain the case with SL2R, which is very interesting, but of course very restricted. So I assume G is SL2R, so it's the matrix, 2 by 2 matrix with real coefficient, and the determinant is 1. Okay, so suppose we have a strongly continuous representation of SL2R. So this is a unitary representation of SL2R. And now we take any sequence of matrices in SL2R which goes to infinity. Okay. So typically, you could take this sort of matrix. This is one example we will deal a lot with, and it goes to infinity when n goes to infinity. So it means, of course, it leaves any compact in SL2R. Okay. Then, if the representation you consider has no fixed vector, then it satisfies that all its coefficients vanish at infinity. Okay. So the only obstruction so that you don't get orthogonal when you go to infinity is that there is no fixed point. Okay. If there is no fixed point, then no matter which vectors you choose, when you go to infinity, you make them orthogonal. That's the theorem. So there are two remarks. First remarks, what is the generality and what is the use of this theorem? So first remark, the proof I will try to explain you will work perfectly well for any non-compact connected simple Lie group. So SL2R is an example of a connected non-compact simple Lie group, and it has a finite center. So in fact, the same proof and the same statement, you could replace G by a non-compact connected simple Lie group with finite center, and the same statement, exactly the same, is true. Now, this is not general enough because it's very important to consider also semi-simple groups. Namely, you take the product of simple groups, but then you have to be careful about the way you go to infinity. So it's also very important to realize that this is not restricted to Archimedean fields. You can consider local fields which are non-Archimedean. For example, it's also true for SL2 QP, and the same proof would work, but we would not be in the Lie setting, but anyway, the same proof would work. So you can also consider reductive group over local field. And I just give the original reference of Moore, and also there is a preprint by Antoine Pinochet-Lobos, which explain all the generalization where you have products. Okay, but what is important is to realize that this is a very general statement. Okay. Now, what are the applications? So here is the main application. The main application is indeed about mixing. Okay, here is the statement. So you consider your group, SL2R, and you know, on any locally compact group, there is a very nice measure, which is called the Haar measure. So what is the Haar measure? This is a nice measure on the sigma algebra of Borel sets. And it is positive on any open set, and it takes a finite value on compact set. It is regular, and the most important thing is that it is invariant under the transformation itself. So if you let the group act on itself, let's say by left translation, then the Haar measure does not change. Okay, for example, if you take the circle, the Haar measure is just the angular measure. For example, for S1, the Haar measure is just d theta. You see, if you rotate things by a little bit, of course, you do not alter the measure. And of course, with R, this is Lebesgue measure. So we recover what we know in the commutative setting, and this is a generalization. Okay, so we consider this Haar measure, and we consider any lattice in G. So what means a lattice in G? It means that this is a subgroup, and this subgroup is discrete, and there is a condition on the Haar measure. So this subgroup is discrete, but it should not be too small. Namely, if you look at a fundamental domain for the action of this subgroup on the whole group G, it should be finite in measure. So there are many examples. There are trivial examples. For example, if you take G is R, and you take gamma is Z, you understand very well both statements. That is, that Z is a discrete subgroup in R, right? Points are nicely put each other apart. It's discrete. And if you look at a fundamental domain, you could choose as a fundamental domain this guy. You see that the fundamental domain has measure 1. Another very nice example is explained in the book, the famous book by Jean-Pierre Serre, the Cours d'arithmétique, arithmetic course. So it is another example. So you take, namely, G is SL2R, exactly what we are considering, and you take gamma SL2Z. So all matrices with integer coefficient, 2 by 2 matrix of determinant 1, and you can obviously see that this is discrete, and you can check that the quotient, you have a nice picture in the hyperbolic plane, which looks like that. So this is the upper half plane, and you can show that this guy, this area is a fundamental domain, and in fact, if you look at what is the measure, then you see, because it's hyperbolic measure, when you go up, the area is smaller and smaller, so it means that the measure is finite. So it's another example of a lattice, very well known lattice. Okay, so now I can state the theorem. So suppose you have a lattice in SL2R, and you can consider the measure which is induced on the quotient by dg. So it means that you just integrate over a fundamental domain. And now you consider a sequence in G which goes to infinity, like in Haumur theorem. Then if you consider the quotient, with the measure dx, then any function here, which is L2, satisfies the following condition. You see, this is very interesting if you think in terms of expectation. In fact, you see that the two expectation becomes, it's as if the variable becomes independent. You could think to this integral, you could think to the expectation related to a variable defined by phi, and you could think to this as the expectation of a variable defined by this function. It's nonsense what I say, it's just intuitive. You need hypothesis that the function should be distribution of probability. It's a very special case, but nevertheless, that's what's going on. And you see that here they are mixed and they get separate. Yeah. So so here it would be the expectation, the mixed expectation of the product of x and the two variables. So namely here, what is important to see is that we have the action on the quotient. So what is this action? So remember, so we have G over gamma, and of course we can act on the right. So there is G which acts on the right. So let's say so if you have a point here, that's what I mean by the action, and an element here is some point x will be some point of the type, let's say gx gamma. And this is a class, right? So it makes sense. It makes sense to multiply on the right because you take class on the left. That's the main point. Okay, now I will try to explain what is the meaning of this last equality in a more intuitive way. And I would like to finish this first part now by just finishing what I can say about example. So this I already said, that the same statement. Of course, you can prove the corollary from the theorem. So each time you can apply the theorem, you can apply the corollary. And here is another example. SLNZ is a lattice in the connect simply group SLNZ. So that's another family of example. And another example where the quotient is not only a finite volume, but it's compact. So you take the fundamental group of a surface, which is oriented, closed, of genus at least 2. So you have hyperbolic geometry. And because the isometry of the hyperbolic geometry is PSL2R, then you can embed this fundamental group in SL2R as a lattice. So that's another example. And of course, you can apply this mixing result. Okay. So, hello.
Yeah, sir.
Yeah,
So
hello.
I was asking the way you said that the fundament that this SL2Z is that the fundamental domain of SL2, the action of SL2Z on SL2R is
Yeah.
finite.
Yeah.
I mean, can you repeat that, sir? I am seeing this for the first time. I mean, I haven't seen this, so that's why.
Yeah. Yes.
So I already know. I want to tell you that I already know that SL2R is acts transitively on H2. That I know already.
Okay, good. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. How are you saying this?
Yes, thank you for your question. So I will take a moment to try to explain this. So here was the picture. Maybe I'm looking for some place where I have more place to do another one. So yes, so
so end of the PDF there are space. Yeah.
Sorry?
At the end of the PDF there is a lot of space, below the reference.
Yeah. So here, yeah, right. But here it's okay. So okay, so you know, as you said, you know that SL2 it acts on H2. So you have A, B, C, D, and okay, Z is a H2 as Z x plus y such that y is bigger than 0, and the action is the following on 1. Right, and you know it's transitive, and now you restrict to SL2 Z. So so in fact SL2 Z is generated by two transformations here, which are let's see, one, and another one is 1 over Z. So I guess I should put Z goes to minus 1 over Z. So I guess I should put C is 1, A is 0, maybe B is minus 1, and D is 1. Yeah. So I guess this one will fit. Okay, so that's a first statement. you could check this. So there is a proof of this in the nice little book by Serre, the Cours d'arithmétique. So what geometrically it means? So you have your upper half plane. Let me draw it like that. So you have E, and so this is H2. And so the first thing you can do is you can choose you could choose a strip.
Yeah.
And you see by the action of this guy, action of powers of, namely, you get the ability to come back inside. So what it is, it's just z plus n. So you can translate, and you can come back into this strip. So you see that a first step is that you can make a fundamental domain inside this strip. Now, the second point is to look at maybe this. So you take a circle here. This is 1, this is -1. And what you draw is this part. Okay? And now when you apply the transformation, the other transformation, you see that this part here, you can put it up, and so at the end you can show that the magenta part is a fundamental domain. And okay, you should choose some part here, choose some point here, and then not choose here if you want a fundamental domain, something like that. And I guess like that. And you show that the magenta part is a fundamental domain for the action. Now, what is the kernel of this action? The kernel of this action is a compact subgroup. You have K, which is SO2R. And it fixes this guy. So it means you have a map from SL to R. Here, K. So we have the subgroup K here, and this guy, K, fixes Y. So in fact, you can imagine you have a little circle here, which is K. And there is a bunch of little circles which repeat everywhere here. Now you have to compute the area of this three-dimensional stuff, which is made of the magenta strip plus each fiber, which is compact. So in fact, if you compute what is the Haar measure, you will find that what you get basically is that you can compute the area of the magenta strip, and you have to also integrate along the fiber, and this is bounded because K is compact, everything is equivariant. So at the end, so the conclusion is the volume. So let me write it here. So the conclusion it's that the volume of SL2R over SL2Z is the volume of K, which you could say is 1 times the area of the magenta part of the fundamental domain F.
Okay.
Let's call that F.
Okay. This is how we are constructing the measure on SL2Z, SL2R.
Yes, exactly. Okay. And of course, you need it's not trivial. You need to have an explicit formula for the Haar measure on SL2R and check that it has some hyperbolic part, which is exactly what you get in the hyperbolic geometry. And here, this is what I claim is that this is the hyperbolic area, maybe up to a constant, of this magenta stuff. And you know that this is finite from hyperbolic geometry.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so that's the explanation. Because the Haar measure of SL2R, there is a part which comes from the affine group. The affine group, which is, let's say, the subgroup of matrix of this kind. Let's call it AF, which is obviously a subgroup of SL2R. Yeah. And this guy, you see that when you want to have a Haar measure, or you would like to understand what is the geometry of this guy, you see that this is isometric to H2. Because there is this horospheric part, the X, and there is this geodesic part, the A, and altogether this is related to the structure of H2. And that's why here you get something which is related to hyperbolic geometry.
Okay.
And the point is that when you go up, in fact, this magenta strip, although it looks like the size is the same, but in fact, it's thinner and thinner. It's like a cusp, right? In fact, it's like a cusp. Should be something like that, geometrically. And that's finite. So there is an exponential shrinking factor, which makes it finite in volume, although it's not compact. That's very interesting. And this is a general fact. If you go to SLNR and SLNZ, the same things are true.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your question. Okay, so now I would like to explain how you deduce the corollary from the theorem. Namely, if you look at the action on the quotient space, this homogeneous space of finite volume, as we have seen, why do you have something which is mixing? So this is very interesting. In fact, you could write a program and you choose some elements in the group, like the power. Here you could choose some function like that, and look at the effect it has on this guy, and you would see something which goes around and goes everywhere, comes back, goes to the cusp, go up, and this is more than ergodic. This is mixing. This is the action of this element on the quotient, and that's the theorem is all about, that it will fill in the quotient space in a completely homogeneous way, in a mixing way. I will explain what mixing means. But first, I explain how you deduce the corollary from the theorem. So to deduce the corollary from the theorem, the first thing to know is that because we have the R measure on SL2R, it's right and left invariants, both right and left invariant. DG is both left and right invariant. This is very important notion in Lie group theory. There is this beautiful book by Raghunathan on Lie groups, and I learned part of this stuff here. So what is called a unimodular locally compiled group is a group where, although the group is not commutative, when you consider the volume, the fact that you act on the right or on the left, it has the same effect, right? So if the R measure is both left and right invariant, although the group is not commutative, then it's very important to notice that you are in such a case. And of course, you can show that the difference between the left and the R measure is what is called a modular function. And this modular function is a homomorphism from the group to the multiplicative group of real number, positive number. So it means that if you have a simple group, there can't be any kernel. So it means that this is a trivial homomorphism. So it shows that if you have a simple group, it's unimodular. But you can also check it directly for SL2 or SLN. So namely, we have this measure which is both left and right invariant. That's the first point. So SL2R is what is called unimodular. R measure is both left and right invariant. So it means that when you consider here the right action, this is the right action, it also preserves the R measure, which traditionally is chosen to be left invariant. So it means that the measure is preserved, so it defines a unitary representation on the quotient. I explain why it makes sense to have an action on the quotient, because we take class on the left and we act on the right, so it's coherent. But now there is a problem. Is it true that we get a unitary representation because now we act on the right? Yes, because the group is unimodular. So each time you have a unimodular group, you can do the same trick. And of course, if you have a simple group, it is unimodular. So it works in any case. Now, there is a technical point. You can check that everything is very nice and that this action gives rise to a strongly continuous representation. This is technical, but it's not something you would be surprised. Okay. Now, of course, G acts transitively on itself, so it will act transitively on any quotient, and so it acts transitively on the quotient G over gamma, which is X. So it means if you have a function which is fixed by this representation that the function has to be constant, right? So any function fixed by pi is a multiple of the characteristic function. This is clear. Okay, now we have a unitary representation, and we know that the constant functions are fixed. This here is very important to realize that the quotient has a finite volume, which we just explained in the case of SL2Z, because we have a finite volume, we can normalize it so that it's equal to 1. So we have a probability space. And of course, if we take the constant function, this is an element in our space. If we had not a quotient with a finite volume, although it may be not compact, that's very important to keep this possibility open. So like, again, the quotient of SLNZ in SLNR, it's finite volume, but it's not compact. But anyway, you can consider the constant function, and this is an element of our Hilbert space. Okay, so we have this line which is fixed by pi, and so it means that we consider, sorry, it's precisely not here, it's here. And so it means that, again, we can take the orthogonal complement to the line generated by this, so namely the line of constant function on the quotient, and the complement space is invariant because the representation is unitary, so it preserves a complement. So we have this splitting, and each piece in the splitting is preserved by our representation. So we write a decomposition. So we have a function which is L2. So it has two parts. And of course, the parts, which is the constant one, you can compute it. It's just the multiplication by the constant function by the scalar, which is the average of the function on the space. And the other part, it's just the difference, of course. Now, back to the formula of the corollary we want to prove. Okay, we want to compute this. Okay, so we integrate in our quotient space G mod gamma, and we have the action G on the left. And we have those two functions, and we compute the integral, the average. Now we can rewrite all those things in terms of the Hilbert structure. So of course, this is the action of pi of G on our function phi. This is the first term. And you multiply it by psi, so this is our psi. And taking the integral is exactly the definition of the scalar product. So we have a complete interpretation of in terms of the Hilbert structure of the unitary representation. Now I will use orthogonality. So you use orthogonality here. So it means each time you have the scalar product of two terms which are orthogonal, you can forget. And what is left is indeed this first term with phi 0, phi 0, and the other is phi 1, phi 1. Each time you have 0 and 1, then you can forget. Now, what is phi 1, psi 1? By definition, is just the integration. Why is it true? Because you see, we have this. In fact, what you integrate here is the constant function. So it's 1 times the scalar, and the scalar are precisely those elements, right? So this is the computation explained by this formula. And the other term is the term we can apply the theorem, namely, so we know that here we have no fixed point because we take the orthogonal complement, and so it goes to 0 according to the theorem. So Moore theorem or Moore. So the conclusion is that we get exactly the formula at infinity, because the term which is the rest in the formula goes to 0. Okay, so that's the proof of the theorem. Now here is a very important interpretation of what we've just done, which in fact turns out to be very general. So what did we just do? So we have a locally compact sigma compact group, so that it makes sense to speak about sequences of elements which goes to infinity, and we assume it acts by measure-preserving transformation. And usually I assume that the action is on the left, but because we just did an example where it was meaningful to have an action on the right, because we want the action of gamma on the left, depends on your taste, but anyway, we had an action on the right, on the quotient, then here I want to emphasize the similarity with what we've just done, so I suppose the action is on the right, but of course you could choose the action on the left. Okay, so we have this situation, we have a probability space, and now what we've just done is completely general, namely saying that the Koopman representation associated to this action is mixing, which means by definition that its coefficients at infinity vanish, is exactly the same as saying that if you have two measurable subsets in X, any sequence which goes to infinity, then you can separate the expectation of the measure when you have this action. And there is a third equivalent way, which is exactly the same, but you say the same with function. So exactly what we've seen, namely you have two L2 function, you have this sequence which goes to infinity, and you have this formula. And what is important to realize is that if you specialize with characteristic function of set A and B, then you would recover the formula here, right? If you take C is 1A, 1B, so here you would have the measure of A times the measure of B, and here what you would have is that you want both functions to be non-zero, so you have in fact the measure of AGI. You want both functions to be non-zero, so you get exactly the same. So you see that 2 and 3 are the same. Namely, if you have 3, then it implies 2. That's just what I prove. You just choose those two functions, and you get this. And I let you complete the full equivalences between those 3 properties. And now I would like to explain the intuitive meaning of mixing in this dynamical system way of saying things. So you have your space X, your probability space X. And now you choose a subset A. And now you choose a test set B, which is like a test. And A, we could ask that A, we could say that A is some initial mass. It means nothing. And now time's going on and you apply the dynamical system. So GI makes its effect. So let's say this is GA. And then you go further to infinity. So it means that GA becomes really something like that. So this is the image of GI where G goes to infinity, GI goes to infinity. And what it says is that the proportion of AGI which fall in B from the point of view of measure is exactly the measure of B times the measure of A, right? So it means that if you look at this part here and you look at the proportion which becomes magenta at infinity, it's exactly related to the measure of B. Namely, if the size of B is big, you expect to get a lot of stuff, and also the initial mass of A. So it means that the mass of A, with G being close to infinity, is uniformly mixed in all the parts of the space X. So that's why I call B a test. So it means you choose some region of the space and you analyze what's the proportion of the initial mass which is put in this test part when the time is great, the time is large, sorry. And the answer is that this is exactly proportional to B, to the mass of B and the mass of A. This is why it is called mixing, because you can understand that the only way that can be done is that the transformation mixed every part, every small part of the space should be mixed uniformly in any other part of the space. So this is the dynamical interpretation of mixing. And what is remarkable again is that you get exactly the right condition in terms of coefficient of unitary representation, which a priori is something which has nothing to do with mixing, right? Okay. Maybe okay. I will try now to explain some preliminary stuff, which is not too difficult, I hope, to prepare the proof of the Hove-Moore theorem. So tomorrow I will explain the proof of the Hove-Moore theorem, and I will do now some preliminary stuff and just stop when the proof begins to be technical, so that we can concentrate in one piece of time on the proof. I don't want to begin it now. So, okay, so what should I need to tell you to prepare the proof? Okay, some basic stuff about Hilbert spaces, sorry. Okay. So if I have a Hilbert space, I consider a linear subspace in this Hilbert space, and this is the orthogonal of V, okay? And V bar will be the smallest closed subspace of H containing V, okay? So the closure of V. And if we have another subspace in our Hilbert space, then of course V plus W will denote the smallest subspace of H, which contains both V and W. It's just notation. And there is a nice elementary fact you should try to check to prove it, like an exercise, a nice exercise. Okay, so you have this. If you have two closed subspace, then if you take the intersection of those two closed subspace, you get something which is smaller. When you take, which is closed smaller, when you take the orthogonal complement, then what you get is the orthogonal complement of V plus the orthogonal complement of W, because you make the space V intersection W small, so you expect that when you take the orthogonal, it's bigger, and indeed, it's the closure of the sum of the orthogonal. So this is just an exercise. Okay. And here are some very easy notions, but they will be very important in the proof. So when we have a subset of our group G, and we have our homomorphism of G into the Hilbert space, the unitary group of the Hilbert space, what we denote by Hx, as we already did, Hx is simply all vectors which are fixed by the representation. Okay, so Hx means that you keep only vectors which are fixed by any element in X when they act via pi. And here, if we have a subspace, if we have a subset, sorry, in our group, so we have X in G, I denote by X with brackets the smallest subgroup of G containing X. And when I put a bar, it means that I take the closure, the smallest closed subgroup of G. So G has a topology, so I can speak about the smallest closest, and we know that it's a group. And this we have obviously, if you have more constraint, then you have less freedom. And so it means that you have inclusion here. And here, of course, if you say that something is fixed by the generators because it's an homomorphism, then it's fixed by any finite product of elements. So this is by definition of the subgroup generated by a set because it's a homomorphism. Okay. Now, if P is strongly continuous, then we also have, and this is very interesting, the other stuff. So here there is the technical hypothesis which should be used. Otherwise, I guess the theorem is not true. So if pi is strongly continuous, then this inclusion is in fact an equality because you have the reverse inclusion. So why is it true? Okay, so suppose I have an element V, which is fixed by X, and I take an element in G. Now, if I take Y a finite product of element of X, then I can say that the norm of this difference is the same as this guy. Why is it true? Because it's fixed, right? And V is an element which is fixed. So it means that here we get V. In fact, this is equal to V. And now I can apply, because it's unitary, pi is unitary. So I can apply pi g minus 1, and so I get this. And now what do I conclude from this? Now suppose G is in the closure of the group generated by X. So it means that I can approximate G by elements of the type Y. So this guy Y, it can approximate G, right? Because G is in the closure of the subgroup generated by X. So it means that for any epsilon, I can choose some element Y, which is a product of element of X, which is epsilon close to G, or maybe in a topology, I don't have epsilon, but I have topology. Okay, so it's very close to the identity. And now we assume that the representation is strongly continuous. So it means that the action of G minus 1 Y is close to the action of the identity by strong continuity. And so it means it goes to 0. So the strong continuity of pi implies that V is fixed. At the limit, it's fixed by P because this guy is small. Okay. Okay, so it means we should retain that if the representation is strongly continuous, then we can not only take the subgroup, but the closure of the subgroup, and it does not affect the set of fixed points. So there is a very nice notion in the proof, which is those sets. So we have a sequence in our topological group G, and we define the subsets of G. So namely, we look at all elements in the group such that the limit of the conjugate of this guy N, which is chosen by the sequence. So here you take conjugate which start with the inverse of AI, and you assume that you get something which converges to the identity in the topological group. Okay, so if it's not the case, then you do not take N. So for example, you could, of course, you could always take N to be the identity. If you choose N to be the neutral element, whatever the sequence is, if you take AI minus 1, AI, whatever the sequence is, it will converge to the identity because it's constant equal to the identity, right? So we see that in any case, this set contains the neutral element. And obviously, using the fact that we have a topological group, you see that it's a subgroup. They are subgroups. Check that. So this is easy. So this is remarkable. So there are subgroups, whatever the sequence is. And now if we choose some special sequence, it will give some interesting subgroup. Okay, maybe one of the last point I need is, yeah, this is the last point I need before we get to some things which are very technical. I will do tomorrow, is what is the weak operator topology. So what is the weak operator topology? So you have a Banach space of bounded operator on H, right? So you take all maps from a Hilbert space to itself, a C-linear bounded operator. So, and you will put a new topology on this, which is called the weak operator topology. What does it mean? So if you have an element A in your Banach space, you will say that the sequence converge to this guy, so it's close to this guy, if each time you fixed two vectors, V and W, and you compute the scalar product of the image under AI, the guy in the sequence, on V, and you take the scalar with W. Okay, so you get a sequence of complex number, and you ask yourself, is it true that it goes to the number you get when you do the same, but with the fixed operator A? And you say that AI converge to A in the weak operator topology, the VOT topology, if and only if this is true for any VW in H. Okay, so a sequence of operators converge in the weak topology, weak operator topology, to an operator if and only if, when you test this convergence in any fixed point, any fixed vector, then you get that it converges like complex numbers. Okay, and you can check, of course, that this is a topology. And with the help of this topology, we will prove the theorem of Hove-Moore. But I will stop here and see you again tomorrow.